Evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our for this year's BCS Winter Lecture. My name is Paul Naylor. I'm the Vice President of the BCS and Programme Chair. Oliver Green has joined us. Just to give you a little bit of background on our Winter Lecture. So each year, our Winter Lecture gives us the opportunity to get a really popular and interesting speaker to present on a subject that our members we think will really enjoy. And tonight we are competing with the World Cup, and it is a glamour tie, Belgium v Canada. So thank you for choosing us over the World Cup. It means a lot. And tonight is a sellout. So we had 100 tickets for Eventbrite and they've all sold. So that is really great news to hear. So thank you all for joining us tonight. It means a lot to us. And I'm pretty sure you will not be disappointed with who we've got lined up as our speaker and the subject that they'll be speaking about. So our lecture tonight is entitled Mapping the Underground, and it gives us an insight into the history of the underground tube map. The lecture will be given by Oliver Green, who is former head curator of the London Transport Museum and now its research fellow. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and an associate of the Museums Association, writing regular exhibition reviews for the Museum's Journal. And he also lectures extensively on the history of transport and design and has published over 15 books. His latest publications are London's Underground, The Story of the Tube, and London's Great Railway Stations. I'm going to hand over to Oliver now, and without further ado, welcome Oliver. And I'm going to hand over proceedings to you now.
Hello, Paul.
Hi, Oliver. I can hear you.
All right. Right. Thank you, Paul. I'm going to fairly briefly, in the course of the next 90 minutes, take you through the mapping cartography of the London Underground, which is a particularly interesting one because for all of you who are map movies out there, it's probably the most expensive and most well-known underground map in the world. And it's actually, at this moment, this time, it's the 50 years from when Harry Beck modelled the London Underground, and it's manipulation at the time. But before looking at the map, just to ring a little bit on the medals of London Transport. London Transport is also 50 years old this year, now of course exceeded by Transport for London, but it became, in the 1930s, when it was first set up and took over all the other underground and other lines in London, it became almost the image of London. And the design style of the underground, and the map is part of that, was really not replicated anywhere else in the world. These two images are just two visions of London in the 1930s, when the underground became your guide to London, and the new underground became, through both the cartography and its other assets such as posters, became some of the most famous in the world. And in some respects, it still is today. The underground, as you'll all know, has opened yet another number of new lines this year. It began a few years ago with a new circular route, which strictly is not particularly the underground, but the overground is still run by Transport for London, and it's integrated very carefully with the underground itself. That's only been open just over 10 years and has been a fantastic extra success to London's underground. The underground is also particularly, and the overground as well, particularly progressive in its employment of running mills. It has drawn more underground women in underground. The picture on the bottom left, if you look carefully, you can see all of those engineers are women. The picture top right is a new train on the London Overground, and top left is the link, one of the links between the old Overground, which took over some of the existing lines, and the Underground. That's a view from the tower just at the very east of the city. On the left-hand side, going up to the left, is a bit of old London from the 19th century, which wasn't an underground, which has now been taken over by London Overground, and is a new route which in the last decade has been circling around the whole of London. There's one of the new trains on the right. That's a bit of the new line linking the Overground with the rest of the city. And I'm also, although I'm not going to talk about places elsewhere, but the bottom right I've put in because I think there are a number of things which have been pioneered in London, which have been having been kept in the last year or so, new overground lines in other cities. Manchester was the first in the 1990s, then Birmingham has just opened a new overground tram link. Other cities in the country have done, but it's all been really quite slow. But hopefully new and electrically powered new trains and overground are running now throughout the city. But just to go back to the 19th century and the problem of how they were going to communicate through the city and whether railways were the best way to do. Here is probably one of the first underground maps of London in the late 19th century. This is about 1889, when the Metropolitan Railway, who had become the first underground railway in London and in the world, in fact, took its cue and was a new basis for London and for the world, actually, as a way of getting around big cities without demolishing the whole of them in the time being. But as maps, as all of you who are cartographers will realize, the maps that they produced in the late 19th century were awful. And this, you know, in terms of design and cartography, is just terrible. That one before, as I say, was the Metropolitan, one of its early maps in the 19th century. This one is a few years later. It's the District Railway. Those of you who know your underground history will know that the District was the first line. The Metropolitan was the first line. The District was the second, opening around what is now the Circle Line in London in 1889. Now, those two lines were not fully underground, as you'll know today. I mean, they have openings around them, but very little of them is deep underground. The real development of what we now think of as the tube came just a few years later at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is the real quarter where the beginning of the 20th century, that first 10 years of the 20th century, began a deep level tubes all over London. This were quite different to the early 19th century lines, which were all steam hauled and couldn't be deep hauled in London. This is the underground map that was produced in 1908, when nearly all the lines you see there, which are still operational, first became underground. The very first was the City and South London line, opened in 1890. This is it down at the bottom right-hand corner, running from the Bank, running down to Elephant and Castle. and all the other lines there, apart from the Metropolitan Circle, are new deep level tubes. Now that means that they had to be serviced by electric lifts, and that there had to be enough space for people to be both taken down into the lifts, and they had to be in appropriate to I'm sorry, I repeat that. Just to remind you, these all opened in about the early 1900s. The city in South London, the sorry to be itchy on the tubes now. This becomes the other lines of that type. The city in South London was first. The district and circle, which are marked there, that's the underground line, and here is the district line. Neither of those two, as I've said, were actually deep underground. But what suddenly happened after the pioneering deep level tube of 1900 is new lines departed what's now the central line, which of course is not yellow or green or any of the other colours, certainly not blue, and that opened in 1900. Then in the next few years, the Piccadilly line, that's in this case yellow, and of course now it's blue. Those two opened early, and the Piccadilly line is here from Finsbury Park down to Hammersmith. That opened in 1905. So by 1908, when this new map was drawn, the essence of the modern underground was suddenly there. It was there and had been built very quickly. It must have been quite a strange thing for Londoners at the time to suddenly be around all the central areas of London and be able to get on them very quickly, use electric lifts, which were a completely new event at the time, and to go down into the depths of London and across the city very quickly in new electric trains. It couldn't have been done by the old steam trains. Being electrified was a huge advantage at the time. So, as I say, all the new underground lines were there in the 19th century. And at almost the same time, only slightly later on, the bus maps were, new bus maps were driven. Throughout the 19th century, the buses in London were all, of course, horse-drawn. By 1911, nearly all of them had been chosen as electric or divine routes, and the change at the time of the 19th century. By 1911, all of the horse-drawn buses had gone, and this is the first London bus map of the time in 1912. And you can see that none of the bus routes go out very further. Very quickly afterwards, they began to use open-air routes that took you out on Sundays to other places. But the very first London bus map is very strictly limited by the early vision of the 1900s. You can see on the left, if you can read it closely, that some of the routes on the far left go out as far as Windsor, which of course is far too long for horse-drawn maps to have done it, but it's run as a special route there for motor buses in the 19th century. And suddenly, once you have motor buses who can go a long distance, you suddenly make London's life quite different, because the LGOC, who'd now electrified, or rather motorized, all these routes, were anxious to get as many people as possible, and that's what they did, because the fares were very cheap. So on Sundays, you could get out as far as you can see on this map to St Albans in the north, to Epping Forest in the east, and down south to where have we got? Down south to Eltham and Beeson right there. At this time, the LGOC was actually a separate company from the Underground, but very quickly the two of them merged in 1912 and effectively were one single bus route. So this was the element of what later became London Transport, all run by one company. If we think back to that early route of the Underground companies, in there the single map of the route appeared to suggest that all London Underground lines were all run by some. In fact, at the very beginning, in the 1900s, there were a number of different companies, and both those Underground companies and the various parts of the LGOC bus map that we see here all came together in the 1900s and came what effectively was the first single element running all of the public transport in London. It wasn't exactly, but it was paraded as such, if you like. The two men who ran the Underground and the LGOC were both effectively running the Underground Electric Railways of London. So both sides were typical of one simply Underground, and the Underground head office, I think was Frank Pick, who was in charge of the publicity, and Lord Ashfield, who was in charge of the whole company. And these two were both very conscious that if they were to succeed in their new and very expensive companies that they created, the Underground and the bus route both had to wash their faces. And when they first began in the early 1900s, it looked very doubtful whether that would actually take place. But actually very quickly, Londoners adapted to the new methods of transport that had been out, and these effectively worked very nice. And the main line railways, who are not a part of these, began to get worried that the Underground company and the bus company would transfer all of the passengers which they were getting, particularly in South London, and that will transfer onto the Underground. So there was a lot of jockeying between the different posts that were operated at the time. This view is the first attempt by the Overground railways, who are not associated with the Underground, to imply their own fast electric trains. This is the first map of what was called the London Elevated Electric Railway, which in fact is just a part of one of the mainline companies, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway, who ran out of Victoria and London Bridge. And if you look at that, all those routes are now fully electrified. I mean, originally they were steam trains, but again in 1908, a key year you could see of London trains, they first of all started beginning a new line round from Victoria round to London Bridge, sweeping up many of the suburbs in South London, and gradually expended electrification on overground services as well as the underground of the two railways. Now, as far as both Ashfield and Pick are concerned, as those running the companies, they showed an astonishing aptitude to create a new underground service, which was practically efficient of the sort of things that the 19th century underground had completely failed to do. They really began to exert a new influence, and that was not just in maps, but in all of the signage. Pick was not obsessed with maps, but he was obsessed about being creative and making sure that all the underground, the new routes that were done and the new telegraph system that was produced were all things that people understood. That was something in the 19th century that, as you can see from that top left platform, which is about 1890. Now, if you were sitting on a train seeing that information that's all over the background there, how would you know where you were? I mean, the underground advertising, none of which is actually advertising anything to do with the underground, but is all general advertisement. And it's completely unbelievable, really. I mean, in fact, that's South Kensington Station, but how would you know it? There's no method of working out where you were. Now, when a couple of decades later, the new underground lines created, Frank Pick in particular was particularly concerned that the information that was actually on the underground, both outside the stations and on the station platforms, was actually helpful to passengers, which made a tremendous difference. And when they opened lines like the Piccadilly and the other deep level lines, they actually worked out a system which made all the underground lines very, very deliberate, I suppose, in how they were helping people going around. There were special signs everywhere taking you what to do. There were passages that were background passages. There was a general view that the most important thing now was the passenger. The old railways, and this included the overground railways as well, were running a service, but they weren't really very concerned about the passengers. And I think Pick and Ashfield together brought a new respect for how you should regard the underground as an advertising man. It's not just about advertising shoe polish or whatever else on the underground system. It's really running a communication which helps people who are running on the underground and helps passengers to see where they were. One of the first things that they introduced was the roundel, or the first beginnings of the roundel. The picture on the left of Dover Street Station, which no longer exists, actually, it's part of Green Street Station. That was one of the first stations that was used the new barcode, which effectively was an actual park and Tufnell Park was repeated all along the platform of the stations. Previously, on the district line stations, which are effectively, of course, are overground, passengers had to rely on platform porters and other members of staff calling out the names of the station. And of course, most of them, you couldn't understand what they were saying either, most of them, as people were always right into the times and saying. And Pitt got the idea that the system needed to have an appropriate underground logo, which people instantly saw, and it had to be separate from all the other advertising that was going on those platforms. So whether it's Dover Street, Tufnell Park, or anyone else, it had to be a particular sense. Now, of course, a red bar is an easy thing to identify with everything else. So that was the first that was needed. And so it was a left bar with the Tufnell Park on the top, and then a red bar behind. And there are still a few of these still surviving. In fact, the original ones for Tufnell Park, and that one there, is one of a set that were discovered only a few years ago in Tufnell Park, locked in a cupboard. They were the original Tufnell Park signs, which there are about 40 of them, showing Tufnell Park along both platforms at the station. And that really did make a big difference. If you think of the mainline railway stations, or even the other underground, so I've seen there with some platforms before, you'd never know where you were. So unless you'd worked out exactly where you were going on the platform, you could be quite a tough thing. And the District Railway, before Pick and Ashfield began this new advertising campaign and signs, didn't seem to understand what was necessary to Metro. This is a District line poster in top right in about 1900. Tickets by district route. Actually, half those tickets on the district route were Metropolitan tickets, but the Metropolitan and the district at this stage were not connected to anything, and it was ridiculous, really, that you could get tickets in different ways on the Circle line, and whether you actually got off at a district line station or a Metropolitan line station, it suggests here that your ticket would be different. In fact, it would be exactly the same. But because the two companies at that stage were still alternate ways of going around, even though it was the same way, they took the idea of using different colours for different routes. Frank Pick very carefully devised a new standard of really a next stage beyond that. Rendell was with a roundel, and this began during the First World War. Pick he wasn't trained as a graphic designer, but he was very close to a lot of underground art designers, and he wanted a system which could be applied throughout the whole of the underground, and that would apply both the lettering and the design of the signs that were used for the underground. And he commissioned Edward Johnston, who was probably one of the key letterers at the time. And Johnson, at the beginning of the First World War, started to begin what we now call the underground roundel, or at that stage they called the underground design roundel. And there is one of the first that he produced during the First World War, with rather than simply a red solid disc, it's a more sophisticated design with the white in the middle, red on the underground lane, and then blue for the lettering. And at the same time, he designed a new typeface for the underground, again during the First World War. And the idea was that this could be used in everything that the company produced. This is when Frank Pick also started using artists to design pictures for the Underground, which became posters, and the posters would produce on the platform and outside of the station, but they were always separate from commercial advertising. So the Underground very quickly, at the time of the First World War, began a present of using underground signs, which would distinctly make the possession of being the Underground's own signs, not advertiser signs. So that picture, as I showed in the last page, of the Underground own lettering and their signs were very quickly separated out from anything really underground. So they're made very distinctive from advertising signs. And that again was something that other railways didn't quite manage. Pick an instinctive design to make the Underground's own sign very specific, whereas other programs were not. And he designed Johnson for Pick, and Johnson was very much a design guru, if you like, of the arts and crafts movement. But he designed a new lettering for the Underground and presented it to Pick in about 1915, 1916. This is one of his first steins. And by the 1920s, after the First World War, that lettering, which is still called Johnston lettering, had become, the Underground was the first organisation in the country to have its own lettering, which presented everything in a present way. This particular view of Hammersmith Station in about 1930. So this is about 10 years after the emblem drew, and everything here is using the Underground sign. Hammersmith on the seating there, all of the platform here and platform here, and the station name board further back. All the back photographs are the Underground. That's the Underground selling the lettering to other people, but the two were never together. You can see there that those which are the Underground signs, and this is a new station which has just been replaced. Everything there is actually organised and designed by the Underground themselves. Everything else that's letter there is done by advertising agencies for whoever's advertising on the Underground. So advertising was important for the Underground, but as Pick was much more impressed about the fact that it should be, the Underground should be lettered properly, and people should always understand which of the Underground still own signs and which are Underground. And that piece of lettering has more or less stood itself ever since. So now when you go on the Underground, you can always tell what is the Underground's own sign and what is advertising on the Underground. And the lettering itself on the Underground is still a variation of that lettering, which is a sans serif lettering built in the early 1900s. So that's over a century lettering, and it still seems very simpler, a very simple design. Right. Now, I said at the beginning that the Underground Electric Railway, who ran all the deep tube networks, but didn't run the Metropolitan line, which of course had expanded from its original version of effectively the early part of the Circle Line. That was all changed in the 1920s when the Metropolitan would not join with the other underground lines and expanded itself from essentially an urban underground line to being something that was really almost a small run out to the countryside. And if you look at this poster from the late 1920s, and everything else that's there, which is now part of the underground, all those Brew lines are either the district or the Metropolitan, but they're not connected with the other underground lines. All of those were actually the Piccadilly and the other lines. But the Metropolitan like to think of themselves as connecting railways and almost a mainline concern. And by 1900, they had moved out from simply offering an early method of getting around the central area to being rather more different and being a posher line. They were more expensive. They ran out to what were effectively becoming outer suburban areas of London. So if you look at this map, which is about 1930, all of the main parts of the Metropolitan up here by the to the left of Baker Street, which was the original, one of the original termini, everything on that line you can see is actually built after 1900. So it's not part of the original line, but it links up with them. And the Metropolitan, as opposed to the other underground lines, saw itself as a different sort of proper suburban railway. So when these lines were running out to the countryside, they ran a very long way, much further than any of the rest of the tube, which is why even today the underground is, if you include the Metropolitan, and of course it's all now part of the tube, but the underground line is quite different in scope to the rest of London's underground lines. And you can also see from the map that they connected in the early 1930s, this one, what their impressions are. Many of the areas of the golf course, for example, which are all the way along the underground lines, are a particular fearsome than this. If you look at the tip on the top right hand corner there, it goes other railways, golf courses, which is obviously their new present. They wanted to have reasonably well-off underground commuters who would perhaps buy a house out in the outer side of the line, where they'd rent out right to Amersham and places in the Chilterns, and even new lines as well. There was a new line you can see to Stanmore, a new line to Watford, and the golf courses are clearly an important part of it, because half of the stations seem to have golf courses run from. So that was obviously the upper middle class who are going to be spindle to the line of the Metropolitan. So the Metropolitan was still separate at this point to the rest of the underground, but finally it would soon be taken over. The Metropolitan thought of itself as a separate railway, but it wouldn't join with the rest of the underground. Now, just to run briefly about another part of what was going on in railways in the 1920s. In 1923, the railways were, who had been effectively nationalised during the First World War, were merged by the government into 4 giant companies: the London North Eastern Railway, the LMS, London Midland and Scottish Railway, the Great Western, and the, what's the third one? The London North Eastern. They were forced into 4 separate companies, but they didn't do anything about what was going to happen with the underground. So the Underground Electric Railways remained a separate company, and the these other lines were all completely separate. But in not going with the underground, there was no policy really as to how the electric would take place. Eventually, in 1933, the underground lines and the Metropolitan were all merged together and became London Transport, which effectively is the beginning of a nationalised service for London. And in this period in the 1920s is where the new methods of portraying the underground were presumed. The mainline railways didn't really have very many maps, but the underground still pursued this idea of a really easy to read map for London. And this is the first one they did in the 1920s, designed by J. MacDonald Gill. And this is an easy to read map, but it's still not as easy as it might be. And 10 years later, the real demonstration that is well known now, but not so well known at the period, in 1931, this map was produced, which was a complete revolution as to how the London Underground map could be made. This is by Harry Beck, who was employed by the Underground, but he was not an underground draftsman. And he did this map on his spare time, so it said, and produced it to the publicity section in 1931. But there was not much interest in it at the time. But eventually he managed to persuade the Underground to produce a new version of the Underground, which was easier to read, and this was produced in small numbers in 1933. And as we think now, 50 years on, this was the metal that was produced in 1931. And this really was an absolute classic. No other underground or other system actually had such a clear line. The principle of the underground that Harry Beck produced is that when people travel on the underground, they don't really need to know exactly where they're going. They need to know how they get there and where they change. And the easiest way to make the system work was to link it all up so that the map produces the underground system produces virtual lines which are diagonal, straight, empties town, and little ticks were produced at all the stations as if they were actually all the same length away. As you'll know if you travel out to Rickmansworth or producing any of the outer stations, the difference between the lines is really quite considerable. But if you simply read London through the underground map, everything is worked and infinitesimal. Now, that might be simply it's an easy way of doing London, which will run surfily portrait. And the underground was the new map was incredibly popular. People are asked to write in to the underground and say what they thought of the new map, and everybody thought it was fantastic. And effectively, the underground map has replaced every other map Harry Beck's map, everything has replaced it, and it's been done every other system. If you look at, say, the Southern Electric system, the overground system by the Southern Railway, which was being electrified at the same time, it wasn't in any sense an easy system to make. I think you could still say the same system now, actually, but the underground system below was very easy to read and became something that everybody knew about London. You always knew that the underground system was there to get you around most of London. Well, Frank Pick, who was really the mastermind of all this direction finding, if you like, of the London Underground, is now actually, at last, perhaps, committed on the London Underground. This sculpture is at Piccadilly Circus, and these mortality, immortality, beauty, utility, these are all perfections which Frank Pick liked to persuade. He was very much a righteousness sort of guy. He took a very moral position on it. He thought that the point of the underground is not just to provide a transport system, but it was a way of letting everyone into London and getting around London. And it was as important, really, as the architecture of the whole city. And in many ways, at the time, the London Underground was seen by many at the time in the 1920s and 30s as perhaps the most adventurous person of the city. And Frank Pick's architecture, particularly when he used Charles Holden, who was the architect of Piccadilly Circus and many of the others, it was a sort of major thinker really of London at the time, and it produced in some ways a reflection of the way of London's development. It was potentially, you could say, the Underground was actually in some ways scoring outer London with new picks everywhere, but it wasn't perfect. But Frank Pick's respect to London, and that includes the map and everything else that he respected to London, was probably a bigger input to London than perhaps Christopher Wren in many respects. So at last, Frank Pick is organised from that. And in many ways, although the big expanse and the creation of Metroland, which all became part of London transport in the 1930s, is still a sort of way of looking at London in a careful, considered way. It's still the way that most people commute into London, particularly from the northwest in Metroland. They have electric trains. They're similar to those of the 1930s, but they're different, and they're not the same as the electric trains that run into any other city. It's a very London thing to do. And at the time, it was seen as a sort of special thing to London, that the Underground was the heart of the city. This next picture, which was done at the time and sent to Frank Pick as a potential poster to London, the Underground, that's a poster by Lillian Dring, who designed this poster when she was an art student in the 1930s. She took this poster and put every aspect of London transport in one picture, and sent it to Frank Pick. Frank Pick actually returned it to her, but he said it was one of the best pictures he'd ever seen. And the only reason he couldn't use it was that, unfortunately, it was too big. None of the posters that Frank Pick had commissioned for the poster are actually on 3 panels like that. So he couldn't use her picture. I think she was very disappointed about it. She actually, this was about over 20 years ago, when I was at the London Transport Museum. Lil Engine came in when we had a special exhibition of pictures by women artists, of which the Underground was far more interested than the main line railways. And this was one of the pictures that she gave to us at the museum. The museum still has it, and I often think they ought to reproduce it again. But you can see from this that she's used every aspect of London transport to be the eyes and ears of London. So if you can see this from where you are, the eyes of London is the National Gallery there. The ears of London is the Albert Hall. The sound of London is the BBC there. The Tower of London, the London Bridge, and the heart of London, of course, is the London Transport Roundel. And all round here, you've got the trams, the buses, the trams, all contributing to the Roman God of London. So a brilliant idea, I think, yes, but and LPTB at the centre there, modern God of transport, brilliant idea. Now, just to use some of the other similars at the time in the 19th century, the next underground line, which was very much influenced by London's underground, was Moscow. The Moscow Metro actually in the 1930s asked London Underground to help them design a new system. It was, of course, very popular with Stalin. It was the new metro system in Russia was going to complete his idea of the new capital. And this is it after it had started. The first line is the one that runs diagonally across them, but it kept going, and they actually met some of the new construction techniques during the war, and it was actually it was apparent during the war that the underground would actually help save Stalin, and it produced. There were actually when briefly we were allies of Russia during the war. There were films made of London Underground and London of the Second World War at that time. So it was a very, in many ways, very respectful to the London Underground. Others that reproduced the Underground in the 1930s were, this is actually the overground railway system in Australia. Others tried it as well. London Underground system in Queens, in New York. If you ever use the New York subway as an underground, and to begin it as a map, it's an absolute nightmare. But in the 1970s, a new system, and this is it, was preserved, which in many ways is their attempt to do the London Underground. But unfortunately, New Yorkers didn't like it. So this 1970s system, which actually would have quite revolutionized travel in New York, was not up for very long. The problem, of course, in America is that it's very difficult to produce the New York subway on a map, because it's so, some of the lines are actually double lines, and it's very difficult to make them on a small scale, making them Velro. And other systems which are not strictly have now been up versus the Tramlook system, which has been operating in Croydon, which people in North London never even seem to, Northgard, they've probably never seen it. But essentially the map is very similar to the Beck map, which was already nearly 50 years old on the Underground map. That may still be expanded. And I just wanted to press this in before the last Underground we have got since. This actually was the Queen's visit to the Elizabeth line, which actually was completely done before her death. And so she was clearly very keen to see the Elizabeth line. And as far as I know, when she actually did go and see it, it was at a time when, and this was just before she died, but she was actually supposed to be opening the opening Parliament at the time, but obviously she was much more interested and got herself up in Elizabeth line Getterill Lane and came to Paddington Station to Lillehammer to do the Elizabeth line. And there she is. This picture was taken only about a month ago. I'm now pretty well end, but the Elizabeth line is the most recent of the Underground lines, and the difference between the London Underground line and anywhere else in the world is you do still have that map. If you try and find a map in New York, you'll find you really can't get one. Even if you do get one, it's so big when it opens up that it's virtually useless for traveling. And as you know, London Underground still has maps, and a new one is produced every 6 months, and it's on every single station of the metal. And the Elizabeth line has gone into the main spectrum for the metro. There it is on its own, but of course it links in every other line of the Underground. The trouble is, and this is always the trouble of a complicated map, the Underground has expanded so much since 1930s designs by Beck, that it doesn't really, it doesn't easily resist on my own. If we look at the London Underground now, that I've tried to do is to incorporate every other line, including the Overground and Tramlook and DLR, are all on one map. It's still pretty good, I think, but there must be a point where it's impossible to do all of them on one map. And even here, where the new Elizabeth line is, you will see that the Elizabeth line doesn't go straight through London as it does on the map I just showed. It's not a full part of London Underground, but it's still, I think, the most delightful line in London. And I'm just going to listen to that for the last step. If you haven't been on the Elizabeth line and see what an incredibly opaque line it is, really, and how well done it is. That's really Woolwich Station, of course. The whole system is now open. It may have been a bit longer than originally fine, but it's a fantastic system of matching, and the more it can be done, whether by maps or other things, the more I think this is cool Elizabeth Violet line in 2022. So that's where I'm spinning off. I'm very pleased to answer questions on things.
Thanks very much for, I think what we all will agree was an absolutely fantastic talk. There's no questions in the chat, although we did have one from 11-year-old Arthur, who which was kindly answered already, Oliver, by Roger Monk. So thank you, Roger, for answering that question. And welcome, Arthur, because it's great to see somebody so young showing a real interest in maps. So welcome, Arthur. Jim Goldsmith, I think he's got his hand up. So Jim, do you want to ask your question? Or are you clapping?
I was clapping, but yeah, very interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Oliver. That was really good. Just wondered, I mean, there's obviously the debate ongoing always about, is it a map or is it a diagram? What's your opinion?
I would say it's a map, but clearly it's a diagram as well. So I don't know which you need. I mean, you couldn't use it for anything else other than for using on the tube, which, you know, if you tried to use it as a map of London, it would be a disaster. But I think for what it does, and it's not claiming to be anything else other than a map of London by the tube, I think it works very well. I mean, if you look at stations or bus stops, even anywhere else, it's so much easier to get around London. I mean, London has got, for example, the small things which are really derived from the underground map on bus stops. Those little Wayfarer maps on bus stops, which you don't get anywhere else. I mean, if you try and get through any other transport system other than London, it's a disaster, and that is all to do with the familiarity people have got of the tube. Whether you call it a diagram or not, I don't know. It's a bit like the idea of people often, you know, wanting, well, you shouldn't, if you see the London Underground, if an underground system, it's the tube, but strictly speaking, the tube is only the deep level bit. Well, if you start splitting hairs like that, you're never going to get everybody's concern about. I think it, you know, it's better, but it's good at both.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Oliver. So we have a couple of questions that have come in the chat, Oliver. First one is from Alex Kent, who asks, do you think Beck was also inspired by the geometric forms of Johnston's font?
Well, he designed, Beck designed it with Johnston's lettering attached to it. So I don't know whether it's is that right to describe it as influenced by. I think, I mean, there were a lot of ideas around geometric design in the 1930s, which may or may not have influenced him. I don't think he ever actually spoke of a particular design. And certainly he had a rather difficult relationship with London Transport, because although he designed the map to begin with and he was paid £5 or whatever, he didn't have control of it. And after the war, the Underground stopped consulting Harry Beck on new arrangements for the Underground. It was done by London Transport's own publicity office, and he didn't like it. And I think parted company with London Transport rather rather poorly.
Thanks, Oliver, and thank you, Alex, for the question. So another one, this time from Ken Field. He asks, there's plenty of transit map folks who think it's time to completely redesign the map because it's arguably no longer fit for purpose. What are your thoughts on that, Oliver?
I don't think it's true that it's no longer fit for purpose. I think it still works very well. And if you completely redid it, where would you go to as well? I mean, there are a number of, maps and books around of London Underground and other systems around. I don't think any of the others are any better than London Underground. So why go to the trouble of doing it all again? It's funny, as soon as they do some relatively small variation on the map, such as you may remember that it was about 10 years ago, I think, that for some strange reason, Transport for London decided to remove the River Thames from the Underground, and all hell broke loose on social media and everywhere else. What are you doing that for the Metropolitan? And actually, at the time, this was during Boris's regime, he actually had to step in and say to Transport for London, put the map back and put the river back, which they did. But quite why they took it in the first place, I don't know. I mean, if you're looking for a map of London which actually showed the river positively, you wouldn't work with the London Underground map, because it's completely unlike the river. It's a sort of Art Deco version of the river. People like it to be on there because it also shows the places you can get the underground boat. But I don't see it replacing anyone else. We'll see.
Cool. I mean, do you think if Beck was still alive today, he would approve of the current design? Because there's no denying it. There's obviously more lines. It's a lot busier now than it was when obviously he did his design. Do you think he'd still approve of the design? Do you think he would have approached it any differently?
Difficult to tell, really. I mean, Beck was a very fussy guy. He actually did design in about 1951. He designed a Beck version of the Paris Metropolitan map, and the London Transport Museum have got a letter that came from the RATP, which was a sort of rejection. Yeah, very interesting, but no, we don't want it. So the Paris Metro map became, as it's always been before, although it's a bit more like Beck now, but it became just a kind of scramble of spaghetti. It's very difficult to read. So if there was a new attempt to do the rest actually, I'm not sure who would. There'd be a huge row about it, wouldn't there? I mean, how would they actually release it and get all the other runs in? I mean, if you could either send it right down to just the underground itself and leave everything else, which might be called not actually underground. I mean, like the DLR or whatever. Yeah. You could do that as well, but I don't quite know how you would decide what you would speed up, because some things like the DLR effectively are underground, even though they don't go underground very much. How you'd what the principles would be. I mean, Beck built his own principles, and it's been a sort of holy grail ever since. Nobody's ever actually thought of a better way of doing it. There are some very amusing alternations of the underground line where you can see a sort of an Art Nouveau version of the underground map. You can see a version showing a Rennie Mackintosh design. There are lots of underground maps that wouldn't be at all, to be except you might have it as a joke, I suppose, for some reason. But I don't think, I've never seen an underground map that actually scores all the sins and a definite measure for me. I don't know. Be interesting to see if someone would. Perhaps it's you should still it in your society and see. I don't know how many of your societies are map makers themselves, but there's plenty of scope for it. And there's probably no other map, certainly no other map of London, which everyone feels so strongly about. I don't think you'd ever have a proper Serval that work.
No, I think that's probably true. I mean, Ken's keen to point out he is one of those that does think it needs a bit of a redesign, Oliver. And if you check the chat, he's actually included a YouTube video in regards to a presentation that he gave about a month or so ago, where it looks at a couple of new versions that he's contributed to this debate about whether or not the tube map does need a redesign or not. So it might be worth taking a look at that if you're interested.
Right. I wouldn't be a full lecturer on it, I must say, and cart down and this is the way it should be for each. I think Beck's idea will live forever, but whether we will actually still have a Beck rack or have some other method, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, you might expect that in cartographic terms, we're not really going to something as venomous as doing a complete redevelop of Beck map, but it may happen. We'll see.
I think that's what's so great about it. You mentioned it. People love the tube map, so it's great to see that people are so passionate about it that they're keen to kind of look at their own version or their own redesign of it and share that with people to kind of find out what they think. I think that's kind of shows how much people hold the Beck map.
Whether anybody else who's designed a map has ever done something which has been quite so popular, I don't think there is anything else. Certainly of a city map, it's quite unique, really.
Yeah, I agree with that. Another question in the chat from Roger Monk. He said, "It's good to see Frank Pick has got some official recognition at Piccadilly Circus. Does Harry Beck have a mention anywhere?"
Yes, there is quite. It's not quite the same. I mean, the Frank Pick one is a sort of artwork as well. It's not. I mean, Pick was a very shy character. I think if someone had thought of picking up a version of Pick as a full memorial, I don't think he would have been able to handle that at all. Frank, I don't know. It's difficult to know whether Harry Beck would have liked it as well. I mean, there are various things around the underground which, in some ways, recognize him. It was only about 20 years ago that it was still London Transport, I think, at the time, actually put the Harry Beck's name on the map that's printed. I think it still is on there now, an original by Harry Beck. And really nobody else. There are some. There is a design of Maximum at Farringdon Station of the not the map, but of the James lettering of which are used on the map. There's a special brilliant conservation. It's difficult in a way because the map is such an amazing thing of London that it almost seems, people might think it's a bit odd to have an alternative version. I mean, it's a you know, a whole metrical of underground which could not very easily be milled in any other way. If it was done, I think people would all want to do something different.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks for that answer. One last comment in the chat, Oliver, for you. So Paula has said, GB Rail Freight have named one of their locomotives after Harry Beck and painted it in the style of his underground map, which you might have already known.
I hadn't heard that. Right, it's a bit odd, really, isn't it? I mean, in some ways, anything which is to do with Beck ought to be in London, not in Wales or anywhere else. I mean, Harry Beck was a Londoner. He didn't design maps for anyone else. Perhaps he should have done. And if you go around most cities in Britain, even I can't remember now whether Manchester has a proper tram maps, which are a bit like Beck's map. But certainly I remember being only 2 or 3 years ago being stranded in some outpost of Glasgow and waiting at a bus stop, and there was absolutely no way of working out where the bus went. They have no not even the spider maps in London are there. And in general, bus maps and the same as Metro really are much the same elsewhere. They don't help you very much. I think that's the great thing about the Beck map, and the reason why Harry Beck was encouraged, if you like, by Frank Pick. It made a really big difference. And I don't think maps on any other transit systems that I've ever come across actually help you very much. I mean, if you're in Paris, you would be definite. It's difficult to even find a member of staff on the underground. Never mind, you know, a map. I mean, that is the great thing about London. It has, for most of London Underground, it has staff as well, and they are as important an addition as the map as well. It's an interesting idea.
Yep, amazing. Thanks, Oliver. Oliver, that looks like that's it for questions. I can't see any more in the chat. So unless anyone on the call wants to come off mute and ask Oliver a question, I think we can call it there for the evening. So Oliver, thank you so much for coming along and taking the time to talk to us all, and thank you everyone that's come along to this lecture this evening. We really appreciate you coming along, and we hope you enjoyed it. All it leaves me to do is just to tell you a couple of things that are coming up. Next year we celebrate our 60th anniversary, so rather than just have a winter lecture, we're going to have a trio of what we're calling anniversary lectures. So there'll be one in the new year, one in the summer, and then another winter lecture. And of course, next year we have our first in-person conference for a few years too. So please do look out for more details about that conference in the new year. So again, Oliver, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really interesting talk. I'm sure all of our members really enjoyed that. I certainly did. So thanks again, Oliver, and thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone.